This Thursday marks 50 years since former Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie was deposed, overthrowing a monarchy that had ruled the country for 700 years. The Marxist-Leninist military junta known as the Derg seized power, and then tens of thousands died at the hands of the new regime, which ruled until its own overthrow in 1991. Well, for more analysis on this, we can bring in Martin Plaut, who's a senior research fellow at the University of London and the former Africa editor for the BBC World Service. Thank you very much for speaking to us on France 24. Selassie is considered by many to be one of the greatest modernizers of Ethiopia, but he also has his critics who point out that he let people starve to death during several major famines. Tell us about his legacy.
Well, he was someone, as you rightly say, who linked the country back to almost biblical times, because Mekonnen, the second, who was the emperor that he took over from in 1913, when he died, well, actually, it was 3 years later that Haile Selassie takes over. Saw himself as the successor to biblical emperors that linked themselves back to the King Solomon. So he was somebody of enormous dignity who saw Ethiopia through some of the most terribly difficult times, the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italians in 1935 under Mussolini, and he then went into exile in Britain, only returning when Britain and her allies like South Africa put the emperor back on the throne with the help of Ethiopian guerrillas. But he was also seen as somebody who guarded the dignity of Africa itself. Ethiopia was the one country that was never colonized. It remained independent throughout the colonial period. And Haile Selassie, in a sense, retained his dignity and sense of worth of Africa. And for that reason, people in Africa revere him as a hugely important leader.
Well, it's not just the people of Africa. The Rastafarian movement, which was born in Jamaica, also idolizes him. Tell us more about that.
Well, that goes back to his original name. Ras means prince, and Tafari was his original name. He took on the name Haile Selassie when he became the emperor. The Rastafarians see themselves as linked to his time, and he allowed them to come and live in parts of Ethiopia, and they still look back to Rastafari as a sort of father figure of their own culture. But he always found them slightly amusing and odd. I mean, they weren't a really important part of Ethiopian culture. And as you rightly said, there were elements of his rule which were poor. I mean, he didn't really deal with the famine of 1973 to 74, when 200,000 people died, with any great success. I mean, he was compassionate. I met somebody who actually went to see him and personally appealed to him to give aid and assistance to the people. And he did indeed. We just waved his hand, and an assistant came along, and the aid was forthcoming. I would say that my friend was then asked to go and help see the imperial lions, which he did. He had a group of lions he used to feed by hand, and he went to see them as well, which was quite an amusing incident. But he was somebody of great stature. He worked with Britain. He was a founding father of the United Nations as well. Ethiopia becomes a founding member of it. So he was somebody who was very much part of the old order and of the new order in Ethiopia, but then finally made a tragic error in refusing to allow regional autonomy in Eritrea, and that led to a terrible war, which was one of the unmarked reasons why he was finally overthrown by the army.
And tell us a bit about what came next. I mean, the Derg junta, how has this all played a part on what we know of Ethiopia now?
Well, the junta under Mengistu was appallingly savage in its repression of any kind of resistance. Mengistu himself has now fled to Zimbabwe, where he lives, although many in Ethiopia would like him to be brought back to face his crimes. I don't think he ever will. And the Derg repressed every kind of resistance, and in itself, that set off a chain of events which finally saw the overthrow of the military regime in 1991. Now, Haile Selassie was taken out by the Derg, was executed, was buried in the palace grounds. Some even said under a toilet, which is possibly untrue. But it indicated how badly he was treated, and with no respect whatsoever. And his own family have asked for him to be rehabilitated. He was later dug up. His body was dug up and was placed in the cathedral in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and it is still a place of reverence. There are many in Ethiopia who still look back on the days of the emperor as one of of stability, even though there were difficult times and there was a war and this terrible famine. There was also something which people don't really remark on very much, but actually, slavery continued throughout Haile Selassie's reign. I mean, I have photographs of some of the slaves bringing tribute to be paid into the war fund for Haile Selassie when he fought the Italians. So he's a very contradictory figure, one who links the ancient past of Ethiopia to its current situation, and therefore is, of course, highly controversial, but still a figure of great respect across Africa.
And let's just focus on Ethiopia these days. I mean, it's no stranger to conflict. We've seen the violence in the Tigray region in recent years. There's also violence along the border with Sudan. Perhaps this is a loaded question, but how do you see Ethiopia coming out of this, and will it ever reach a kind of stability?
Well, Ethiopia has never been really a stable country. The princes always used to fight each other, and after the Menelik regime came, emperor was in the 19th century, they expanded to a huge area. The size of Ethiopia doubled, if not trebled. And they took in, from being, say, a dozen nationalities, they took in nearly 90 nationalities. Now you can imagine how destabilizing that has been. And that the fight between the center and the periphery, in a sense, and all these different groups has continued ever since. At the same time, it is growing fast now under Prime Minister Abiy. There are a lot of questions about how he has ruled as well, and he is now in conflict with Somalia over whether Somaliland should become an independent state, which is a very controversial issue. The current prime minister would like to have an Ethiopian navy once more, even though it has no coastline. So there are all sorts of strange elements to the Ethiopian situation. And the Egyptians are now on a collision course with the Ethiopians because a huge dam has been built across the Blue Nile. Now, it's only a hydroelectric dam, so it doesn't use the water, but the Egyptians are furious that they do not any longer control one of the main tributaries to the Nile, which is, in essence, their only source of water, since almost no water falls on Egypt itself. So you can imagine this is a very, very difficult situation for the Ethiopians to find themselves in. But they are enormously resourceful people. They have great intelligence and capability to overcome the most difficult circumstances. And I'm sure that in due course, Ethiopia will be a powerful and prosperous country and remain a leader of Africa.
All right, well, on that note, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much, Martin Plaut from the University of London.